Good morning, everybody, and welcome back to Next Door Net Admin. Now, I've mentioned before that not all admins work in a massive data center with racks and racks of equipment, but there are times where you do need to work in a data center with racks and racks of equipment. What does a data center look like? What does it look like inside? I actually have some business at a data center where we have some equipment today, and I'm going to see about taking you inside. And what does it look like from the outside? It looks pretty nondescript. Just a building sitting there. Nothing much to it. What's different is when we go inside. Follow me and I'll take you in. Now, it is important to note, not every data center is the same, but every data center that I've ever been in has multiple rooms where equipment is stored. I typically call these pods, but terminology may differ. Each one is protected with its own access controls. Typically, at least two factors. You'll need a swipe card, a PIN, a fingerprint, something like that. This one is very much of the swipe card and PIN variety. Shoe covers requested. Let me key in and we'll go inside. And here we are. It's a lot louder because of all the air conditioning and all the equipment, but this is it. This is a fairly small room as far as data centers go, probably because we're at the back of the hallway and all, but this is it. Lots of noise, lots of equipment. Flipping the camera around, one of the things that you'll note in a lot of data centers is a cart, much like this. This is just a monitor, a keyboard, a mouse, and the cables necessary to plug it into power and into a system. This is often referred to as a crash cart, largely because in a data center, the only time you need one of these is if your system has crashed. So that's what it's there for. We'll just pull that around, wheel it up into one of these cubicles. Corridors more like. This one is ours. And when you get your key out, which I have right here, there we are. Oop, there we are. You can see that inside we have a router, we have a switch, we have a server or two. I'm actually here to do maintenance on this equipment today, but you'll have a key for the front and the same key. Well, that was the back actually. You'll have a key for the front and a key for the back. The same key will typically work on both. And there you go. This is what a data center looks like. Something you'll notice about working in a data center is that there's different capacities. There's a nice big HVAC unit, but you can have full rack enclosures like this. A little bit further down there, you can see half rack enclosures. On this side, we've got quarter rack enclosures, and then little eighth of a rack enclosures. And you can see here that I've got the crash cart hooked up, hooked into power, video, the monitor cable, keyboard and mouse. Don't worry, my equipment hasn't crashed. I just needed to access the console to shut it down and turn it off for maintenance. It looks like there's a lot of cables here, I realize, but it's also somewhat cramped working conditions. Everything needs to fit in here when the door closes. So the cables tend to get snarled up a little bit, unless you cable tie it, and clearly that hasn't been done here, though it would have been better if it had. Another thing you'll note, a rack will typically include power, but I also put in my own power distribution unit here because I can actually tap into it to monitor how much power is being used. Currently 0 amps. This equipment's still running, but apparently it's not enough to register on the meter here. But I can remotely control these outlets as well to turn them off and on again if I need to reboot something the hard way remotely. we do have just a little quarter rack here, which gives us roughly 10 U's of space. A U is a unit, roughly equivalent to about 1.5 inches, 1 3/4 inches, I think is technically what it is. So we got 10 of those here. And as you can see with what we had in here, it works just fine. Another thing I'll note about these doors is that they typically have pins that you can just pull down, and they'll detach the door completely off its hinge. It's not really a hinge, but these pins act as the hinge, and so you can take the door off completely if you just pull the pins. This is useful for getting equipment in or out, because then you don't have the door in the way. These particular racks are very tight toleranced, so it is absolutely impossible for me to get any of this equipment out unless I take the door off first. So it's useful to know that the doors do come off, specifically because that's a necessary thing. All right, I'm going to put this down and continue on with my work for now. One of the things that's important to note is that up until now, I've been using the term data center for the kind of environment that I just showed you. There is a more technical term for it. Technically speaking, a data center could be any large collection of equipment, particularly servers and networking equipment. But if it's a facility that allows customers to put their own equipment in there, like I just showed you, the technical term for this is a colocation facility. A colo, for short, is what you'd probably be wanting to search for if you were looking for a place like this where you could store your own equipment and have it there. Why do we use a colo? Well, there's a few different reasons. Number one, it typically has very reliable service, very reliable internet, very reliable power, very reliable cooling. That's kind of their whole reason for being there. Number two, it means that you've got a professionally managed facility that can look after these sort of infrastructure needs, and you don't have to rely on your typical office building, which may not have great power, may not have reliable internet. These places do. Typically, even for internet, they'll have connections to 2, 3, 4, maybe even 6 different ISPs, and they're all big ISPs. They're not your standard, here's your home connection. That wouldn't cut it for something like this. So that's why they exist. That's most of what I was going to show you, at least while I was here on site. Let's head back to my usual locations, and we'll see what we can do about wrapping this up. See if there's any further comments that I want to talk to you about. So, see you in a minute. So yeah, that was a colo. Pretty cool, huh? I know I thought that it was really cool the first time I walked into one of those. It was actually in the basement of an apartment complex with some commercial offices on the lower levels. But the basement was an entire data center, a co-location facility. And it was an eye-opening experience, I would say. I've never stopped finding it cool. Even when it's a smaller data center, even if it is just a small little pod like the one that I showed you, it's still really cool. And I like being there with all of the masses of equipment and networking and all the stuff that's going on, even if I don't know even a tenth of it, because all I know is what's in my area. But there could be so much else happening there, and I have no idea what it is. It's just really cool to be in a place with all that equipment. I'm a geek. You may have figured out by now, but yeah, that's the kind of thing that I find really interesting. So, when you're looking at getting a colo space for yourself, first and foremost, the thing you're going to see is a measurement of how many units you have, how much physical space you have available for your own equipment. Like I mentioned, they might measure it in how much of a rack, full rack, half rack, quarter rack. They may measure it in units. 42 units is a full rack, 21 units is a half rack, then they'll go down to 10 units for a quarter, and so on and so forth. You won't get anything less than an eighth of a rack, typically speaking, and even that can be hard to come by because it's the smallest amount of space and therefore the most economical, especially if you only want to slap in a single server, maybe a router, no need for a switch unless you've got multiple devices in there, and maybe a power distribution unit if you're not relying on the one that the colo already made available. Like you saw, there were 2 plugs there on the front. There were also more on the back, so it can actually take quite a bit of power being plugged into it. But I like having one that I can control remotely for professional purposes, so that I can try and minimize the amount of times that I have to physically drive out there in order to take care of something. It's one of those things. Some colos will offer what's called remote hands, which is if they have a technician on site, you can call the technician, direct them to your equipment, and tell them exactly what plug you want them to unplug, how long, what to do, etc. But you need to know exactly what you're telling them to do, because they are just hands and eyes to some extent to tell you what's happening, but they're not there to figure your equipment out. They're not there to figure out what's gone wrong. They're just there to tell you what they see and to physically manipulate the equipment as you tell them to do so, no more and no less. Most of the time, I'll just go out there and drive. For me, that is usually within 30 to 40 minutes. And since I don't do any work on it during the day, I can afford to, have that kind of response time at night when nobody is using the equipment. Night access, most colos will give you access in the night. How that happens can change. Before the pandemic, our particular colo had a guard there overnight. If you needed to buzz in, he was there to look at your ID. He was there to make sure you had your ID card and essentially keep watch over the site, because it's a secured building. There are other businesses in there. So he's there to make sure that you have access to the data center, but that other people aren't coming in and trying to break down doors and steal equipment, etc. So, cool. But after the pandemic, they don't have somebody on site 24 hours anymore. It's just a thing that went away. What you can do is call an emergency number, and they will send a security guard out to open the building and give you access to the data center. That comes with an extra charge. You can also schedule it in advance. If you schedule your after hours work in advance, they will make somebody available who can keep the data center open, sort things out, lock up when you leave, whatever. But if it's an emergency, if equipment has crashed and you're going out there in the middle of the night, you're going to have to call the security guard. You're going to have to wait for them to actually show up and let you in. And there's going to be an extra charge for that. I have had to do this. A late night update on the equipment went wrong and it wasn't rebooting. And I had to get in there to actually physically drain the flea power, which is a term. Yes, I'm not explaining it right this second, but maybe we'll talk about that another time. Who knows? But yeah, I had to get in there to physically manipulate the equipment. And this was at 11:30 p.m. at night. So it's not the most urgent thing in the world, but I need to get this done by 6 a.m. the next morning, because that's when our customers are going to start logging on and trying to use the website. And if it's not there, that's a problem. So I had to call the security guard. I had to get in there. It took me all of 5 minutes. I had to wait almost an hour for the security guard to show up at the site. But I was able to get in there. I was able to do the 5-minute repair that was necessary. And everything was up and running the next morning as it should have been. Then I went to my bosses and I said, we're going to get an extra charge. I know we're going to get an extra charge. There's nothing we can do about it. It was necessary. Here's why. Here's the business justification for me having incurred this charge. And no, I didn't wake you up because it was 11:30 at night. I already knew it had to be done, and it was a justified business expense, not a, it would be nice to. No, this was necessary. So I made the decision on my own, presented it. It was handled and taken care of. That's a thing. What are some other things that you are going to look for that could cost you money if you're looking to get a colo space of your own? Connection speed is one of the biggest ones. How fast is your connection to the internet? At a colo like that one, there are connections that will go as low as 10 megabit. And that sounds like a really small number, particularly in this day and age where everybody has 500 megabit, 700 megabit, a gigabit connection at home. But what you have to understand is in a colo, you're not downloading masses of information. You're not watching Netflix. You're not watching YouTube. You're not streaming a whole bunch of stuff. Typically speaking, in a colo, you are providing a service, which could be a website. Depending on your website, that might be media heavy. It might be media sparse. If it's just text and, HTML files, then 10 megabit is quite a lot. It's probably more than you actually need. If it's media heavy and you've got videos embedded in your website that are not coming off of YouTube, if it's on YouTube and you're just linking it to your website, your server doesn't have to deal with it. But if you've got video files that are on your server, then you might need a speedier connection. As an example, going from a 10 megabit connection to a 100 megabit connection at that specific colo is an extra $300 Canadian a month. Just to go from 10 megabit to 100 megabit. It is unmetered, which is another thing to watch out for. Unmetered means they're not going to cap the amount of traffic that you can send. This is something that I typically see in virtual private server environments where you're just getting a virtual machine online. They'll say you have a traffic limit of 2 terabytes of transfer a month. Anything more than that, you're going to get billed extra. Something to keep in mind. Sometimes your connection may be burstable, which means that you can technically go over your connection speed limit. If your speed limit is usually 10 megabit, that means you can actually go as high as 50, 100, whatever you want. But if it's burstable, then they're probably using something called 95th percentile billing, which is not a concept I find intuitive. And I typically explain it very, very badly. So if you really need to know about 95th percentile billing, if I get a million questions about it, or probably even 2, if I get 2 questions about it, then I might try to explain that in another video. But I'm going to steer away from it for now because I already tried explaining it once and it didn't go so well. So we're going to leave that aside for now. But other things that you might see in the specification for a colo, how much amperage you have available. You will typically know how much wattage is required for the equipment that you want to put into the colo. And then it's the simple equation of voltage times amperage equals wattage. So if you're in a country with 220 volt power, you're going to require less amperage. And in countries with 120 volt power, you're going to need more amperage. I think I've seen amperage at like 3 amps, 4 amps, in that range. And 4 amps at 120 volts is, 400. 4 amps at 120 volts is 480 watts, which does not sound like a lot, but under most circumstances, it's probably fine. The servers aren't necessarily doing anything super powerful if they're just providing a website. They're not doing AI, they're not doing machine learning, they're not doing any sort of video anything. But again, your needs may differ. If you have equipment that needs to go into a colo, if you're doing machine learning or other stuff that is computationally intensive, then you might need the ability to run 1,000 watts, 1,500 watts, etc. And you'll need to make sure that you have the power allocated to do that. And if you're going to go over the limit that they are providing you included in your price, then you're going to want to know how much extra that's going to cost as well. When I showed you the PDU, the power distribution unit that I put in there with the meter on it, it was showing 0 because I had just powered off the server and only the router and the switch were running. But typically speaking, that was hovering somewhere in the 2 to 3 range. When I had a full server running, I had a backup appliance running, a router, a switch, and obviously the PDU itself. Wouldn't go above 3 for the most part. So if there was a 4 amp limit, I was still under that limit. And so that means that I was I was definitely using less than 480 watts of power, but probably less than 450, all told, for 4 pieces of equipment. So it's very doable, but again, it depends on what you've got there. That's a few of the things to think of when you're looking at getting a co-location facility or putting your equipment in a data center. But hopefully that glimpse of the data center, of the colo, was interesting for you all. Maybe you found it as fascinating as I did the first time I was in there. Maybe it gives you something to shoot for. Find yourself in a job where you can actually go to a colo sometimes for some of your work. Maybe not all of it, but maybe some of it. In any case, I really hope you enjoyed that video. Thank you very much for watching. I am your next door netadmin, and we will see you next time.